The alien guard looked at the starving human child and saw a victim. He laughed when he kicked her stray cat across the cell. He didn't realize that in that moment, he hadn't just hurt an animal, he had unlocked a monster. The suppression collar snapped. The silence ended. And the 8-foot-tall warrior realized too late, you can starve a human, you can lock them up, but if you touch their pet, you sign your own death warrant. Station 9 was known across the galaxy as a place where hope went to die. It was a cold, dark prison floating in deep space. The walls were made of rusted black metal, and the air always smelled like old oil and wet dog. The only light in the long hallways came from the flickering red buzzing of the laser bars that kept the prisoners inside. In the darkest corner of Block C, there was a small, dirty cell. Inside this cage sat a creature that the alien guards did not think was dangerous at all. It was a human child. Her name was Maya. She was only 10 years old, with messy dark hair and clothes that were just rags. She looked incredibly small and thin, sitting on the freezing floor with her knees pulled up to her chest. The jailer in charge of this block was a massive alien named Krug. Krug was a terrifying sight. He stood over 8 feet tall, with thick, green scales covering his body like armor. He had 4 powerful arms, and his face looked like an angry lizard. Krug loved his job because he was cruel. He enjoyed making the prisoners afraid. He walked down the corridor with heavy steps, his metal boots clanking loudly against the floor. Clank. 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 Every time he walked by, the other alien prisoners would shrink back into the shadows, terrified of his shock baton. But Maya never moved. She never looked up. To Krug, she was just a Terran cub, a weak and useless thing that would probably not survive another week. He laughed at her silence, thinking she was broken. But Krug did not know that Maya was not truly alone. Hidden in the deep shadows behind her small back was a secret. It was a cat named Scrap. Scrap was not a pretty animal. He was a skinny, stray cat with orange fur that was dirty and matted. One of his ears was torn from a past fight. He had sneaked into the prison through the air vents looking for food and had found Maya. Instead of eating the tiny ration of food the guards gave her, Maya had shared it with the cat. Now, they were inseparable. In this cold, nightmare world, Scrap was the only warm thing Maya had left. Maya moved her hand slowly, careful not to let the guard see. She gently scratched Scrap behind his ears. The cat closed his eyes and let out a soft sound. Purr, purr, purr. The vibration against her side was the only thing keeping Maya sane. She whispered softly to the animal, telling him he was a good boy. The aliens watching on the cameras didn't care about the cat. They thought it was just a pest, a rat with fur. They didn't understand humans. They didn't know that for a human, a bond with an animal is sacred. They didn't realize that the small, weak girl was pouring all her remaining spirit into protecting this little cat. It was the calm before the storm. The routine of the prison was always the same, broken only by the harsh sounds of feeding time. The heavy metal door at the end of the hall groaned open, and the heavy footsteps of Krug returned. It was time for the evening meal, although meal was a generous word for it. Krug carried a large bucket filled with a thick, gray sludge that looked like wet cement and smelled even worse. He moved from cell to cell, splashing a ladle of the gray goop onto the floor or into dirty bowls. He enjoyed watching the starving prisoners scramble for it. When he reached Maya's cell, he stopped. He pressed a button on his belt, and the red laser bars flickered and turned off. The barrier was gone. Krug stepped inside the small cell, his massive frame filling almost the entire space. He held a bowl of the gray food in one of his lower hands, sneering down at the small human girl who was still huddled in the corner. But this time, Maya wasn't the one who moved. Scrap, the little orange cat, smelled the food. The poor animal was starving. Instinct took over, and the cat forgot to be afraid. Scrap trotted out from behind Maya's back, his tail held high in the air. He let out a loud, demanding meow, his eyes locked on the bowl in Krug's hand. The cat walked right up to the giant alien. Innocent and trusting, Scrap rubbed his small, furry head against Krug's heavy combat boot, purring loudly and weaving between the alien's legs. He was just a hungry animal asking for a scrap of food. He didn't understand that monsters like Krug had no heart. Krug looked down, annoyed by the soft feeling of fur against his leg. He hated soft things. To him, softness was a weakness, and weakness deserved to be punished. A cruel grin spread across his lizard-like face. "Get away, you filth," he grunted, his voice sounding like rocks grinding together. He didn't simply step away. Instead, he pulled his massive leg back. The movement was fast and violent. Before Maya could even shout, Krug swung his heavy, metal-plated boot forward with terrible force. The sound was sickening. It was a loud, wet thump that echoed instantly off the metal walls. The kick caught the small cat right in the ribs. Scrap was launched into the air like a ragdoll. The little orange body flew across the cell and slammed hard against the far wall. There was a dull crack, and then the cat slid down to the floor. Scrap didn't land on his feet this time. He landed on his side and didn't get up. He let out a short, pained wheeze, and then went completely still, his small chest barely moving. Krug laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook his chest. He dropped the bowl of food on the floor, spilling it everywhere. "Oops," he mocked. The entire prison block went deadly silent. The other prisoners stopped eating. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Krug thought he had just kicked a pest. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. The silence in the cell was heavier than the metal doors. Usually, when Krug hurt someone, there was screaming. There was begging. He waited for the human child to cry. He wanted her to wail and run to the corner, shaking with terror. But the sound never came. Maya did not make a noise. She did not look at the spilled food. She did not look at the giant alien looming over her. Slowly, she uncurled her legs. Her movements were not jerky with fear, they were smooth and completely calm. It was unnatural. Krug frowned, his 4 eyes narrowing. This was not how prey was supposed to act. "Stupid beast," he growled, kicking the empty food bowl toward her with a clatter. "Eat your sludge, human. Or do you want to fly like your rat?" He laughed again, expecting her to flinch. She didn't. She didn't even blink. Maya turned her back on the monster. She walked softly across the cold floor to where Scrap lay crumpled against the wall. She knelt down, her knees hitting the hard metal without a sound. Her hands, usually shaking from the cold, were now steady as stone. She reached out and touched the cat's side. It was warm, but the breathing was shallow and ragged. A small trickle of blood came from the cat's nose. Maya brushed the fur on Scrap's head one last time. It was a gentle touch, a stark contrast to the violence that had just happened. She could feel the tiny heartbeat fading, fighting to stay rhythmic. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The other prisoners in the nearby cells pressed their faces against their laser bars, sensing a change in the atmosphere. They felt something dangerous waking up. Maya stood up. She did not rush. She turned around slowly to face the 8-foot-tall jailer. When she lifted her head, her hair fell away from her face, revealing her eyes. They were no longer the eyes of a scared child. They were void of light. They were dark, empty pits that held no fear, no sadness, and no mercy. It was the look of a creature that had nothing left to lose. Krug stopped laughing. The scales on the back of his neck stood up. For the first time, he felt a strange sensation in his gut. It was instinct. His predator brain was screaming at him that he had made a mistake, but his arrogance was too loud to listen. He took a step back, confused by the sudden pressure filling the room. The small girl took one step toward the giant. She did not raise her voice. She did not shout in anger. She simply let out a long, tired sigh, as if she was disappointed that it had to end this way. She looked directly up at Krug's 4 eyes. Her voice was soft, like dry leaves scraping on pavement, but it carried clearly through the silent prison block. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. She paused, tilting her head slightly. The suppression collar around her neck began to hum, sensing her rising pulse, but she ignored it. She spoke 3 final words that froze the blood in Krug's veins. "Now you die." Krug stared at the small human for a second, stunned by her words. Then, a harsh bark of laughter erupted from his throat. The idea was absurd to him. A 10-year-old girl threatening an elite alien warrior. It was the funniest thing he had ever heard. "You," he wheezed, wiping a tear from one of his 4 eyes. "You are small. You are nothing but a worm. And I crush worms." He took a heavy step toward her, intending to grab her by her rags and throw her back into the corner. He expected her to flinch, but she stood her ground like a statue made of iron. That was when the prison's automated security system kicked in. The heavy metal collar locked around Maya's neck began to glow a bright, angry red. This was the suppression collar. It was designed to detect aggression. If a prisoner became dangerous, the collar would deliver a powerful electric shock that could knock out a full-grown alien ox. The collar began to beep rapidly. Beep. 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 Then, the shock came. A bolt of blue electricity crackled around Maya's neck. Usually, this amount of voltage would make a prisoner scream and collapse instantly, foaming at the mouth. Krug smiled, waiting for her to fall. But Maya did not fall. She did not even scream. Her body jerked slightly from the pain, but she remained standing. Her jaw was clenched so tight that her teeth made a grinding sound. A thin wisp of smoke began to rise from her skin where the metal burned her, filling the air with the smell of ozone. Krug's smile vanished. His eyes went wide. No species in the galaxy could withstand a level 5 shock while standing up. "System malfunction," he muttered, confused. He tapped his belt, trying to increase the voltage, but nothing changed. Maya was simply ignoring the pain. Slowly, Maya raised her hands. She reached up and grabbed the burning hot metal collar with her bare fingers. Her skin sizzled, but she didn't seem to care. She wasn't acting like a child anymore, she was acting like a machine. She dug her fingers under the rim of the steel band. Her muscles, though small and thin from starvation, suddenly became rock hard. The adrenaline of a human protecting their pack is a terrifying thing. It bypasses pain. It bypasses limits. The collar whined as the metal began to bend under her grip. Sparks flew everywhere, showering the floor like fireworks. With a guttural growl that sounded like a wild animal, Maya pulled her hands apart. Crack. The sound was as loud as a gunshot. The heavy steel mechanism snapped in half. The broken pieces of the collar clattered uselessly onto the floor. The red light on the device flickered and died. Maya stood there, rubbing her raw, burned neck. She rolled her shoulders, finally free from the weight. She looked back up at Krug. The giant alien was no longer looking at a prisoner. He was looking at a predator that had just slipped its leash. For the first time in his life, Krug felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He realized too late that the collar wasn't there to keep the human weak. It was there to keep everyone else safe from her. Panic finally took over Krug's mind. The giant alien realized that standing still was a death sentence. With a roar of fear, he reached for his belt and pulled out his heavy shock baton. The weapon hummed with a lethal purple energy, capable of stopping a charging beast. "Die, monster!" Krug screamed, raising the weapon high above his head with 2 of his arms. He swung it down with all his might, aiming to crush the small girl into the floor. But he was fighting a human, and he had forgotten that humans evolved on a world where survival meant being fast. To Maya, the giant alien looked like he was moving in slow motion. The adrenaline pumping through her small veins made the world sharpen into focus. She didn't block the hit, she didn't need to. She simply wasn't there when the weapon landed. Maya ducked under the swing with a speed that was a blur to the alien eye. The shock baton smashed into the metal floor where she had been standing a millisecond before, sending sparks flying everywhere. Before Krug could lift his arm for a second strike, Maya was already moving. She stepped inside his guard, right up against his scaly leg. She didn't have claws or fangs, but she knew physics. She drove her small, hard fist directly into the side of Krug's knee joint. It was a precise, brutal hit. There was a sickening pop that echoed like a dry branch snapping. Krug's leg buckled instantly under his massive weight. The 8-foot-tall jailer let out a high-pitched shriek of agony and crashed to the ground, shaking the entire cell. Now, the roles were completely reversed. Krug was on his knees, gasping for air, clutching his shattered leg. He looked up, expecting the child to run away now that he was down. But she didn't run. She stepped closer. Krug tried to crawl backward, his claws scratching uselessly against the metal floor. He was terrified. "Stay back," he yelled, waving his remaining arms frantically. He tried to swing the baton at her again from the ground, a desperate, clumsy strike. Maya caught his wrist in midair. Her grip was like a steel vise. She looked him in the eye, her face a mask of cold fury, and twisted his wrist. Krug dropped the weapon with a whimper. Maya picked up the shock baton. For a second, Krug thought she would use it on him. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the electricity. Instead, he heard the sound of metal tearing. He opened his eyes to see Maya snapping the thick weapon in half over her knee as if it were a twig. She tossed the broken pieces aside. She didn't need a weapon to hurt him. She wanted to do this with her hands. Krug tried to scramble toward the open door, dragging his broken leg behind him, leaving a trail of slime. He was almost at the hallway, almost safe. Then, he felt a small hand grab his thick tail. Maya dug her heels into the floor and pulled. With a grunt of effort, she dragged the massive alien back into the center of the cell. She stood over him, casting a long shadow. The hunter had become the prey. The red emergency alarms were screaming through the hallway, flashing against the dark walls like a warning heartbeat. The commotion in cell block C had finally drawn the attention of the station's elite security team. Warden Thrax, the commander of the entire prison, stormed down the corridor. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed guards, their plasma rifles raised and ready to fire. Thrax expected a riot. He expected to find a gang of prisoners trying to escape. When he reached the open door of Maya's cell, he prepared himself for a war. He shouted for the prisoners to get on the ground. But as he stepped inside, the words died in his throat. The scene in front of him made no sense. There was no army of rebels. There was only silence. Krug, the station's most brutal jailer, was lying in a heap in the center of the room. He was alive, but he was broken. His armor was dented, his leg was twisted at a wrong angle, and he was unconscious, drooling on the floor. The mighty alien warrior had been taken down completely. Warden Thrax looked around frantically for the monster that had done this. He swung his weapon toward the corner of the cell. There, sitting in the shadows, was Maya. The terrifying rage that had filled the room just moments ago was gone. The girl was no longer a predator. She was just a child again. She was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, holding the limp body of the orange cat in her arms. She was weeping softly, her tears falling onto the cat's dirty fur. She didn't even look up at the guns pointed at her head. She didn't care if she lived or died, she only cared about her friend. The guards' fingers tightened on their triggers. One of them stepped forward to shoot the girl, but Thrax threw his arm out to stop him. "Hold fire," he ordered, his voice trembling slightly. Thrax was old, and he had read the ancient files on humans. He looked at the broken suppression collar on the floor. He looked at the shattered shock baton. Then he looked at the girl crying over the animal. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The human hadn't attacked for power. She hadn't attacked to escape. She had destroyed his best guard simply because he hurt her pet. Thrax realized that if they shot at her now, the demon inside her would wake up again, and this time, none of them would survive. Thrax lowered his weapon slowly. He made a decision that would save the lives of everyone on the station. He turned to his head medical officer. "Get a vet," he commanded sharply. "Bring the best medical kit we have. Save that animal immediately." The guards looked at him like he was crazy, but they obeyed. Thrax watched as the medic rushed to help the cat. He saw Maya look up, her eyes filled with hope instead of murder. The warden let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He learned a valuable lesson that day, one that would be written into the prison rulebook forever. You can starve a human, you can lock them in the dark, and you can beat them. But if you value your life, you must never, ever touch their pets.